All right, I guess we're good to go.
We're good to go.
Greetings and welcome to this celebration of the publication of not one but two books in the series Curriculum Theory series, both concerning ancient and indigenous wisdom traditions, one in the context of the Americas and the other in the African and Euro-Asian contexts, both edited by Ehaab Abdou and Theodore Zervas. I'm Kieran Forde, the chair for today, joining you from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Along with our host, Bill Pinar, I'd like to thank you for joining us today from wherever you're located. Feel free to share a greeting or acknowledgement in the chat about where you're tuning in from today. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube later today. We'll hear from the editors, after which several of the authors will speak about their work. Towards the end of our time, there will be a question and answer session of about 20 to 30 minutes on both books. You can drop questions in the chat as we go along that we can come back to, or you can keep them until later. We'll begin with a few words from the series editor, Dr. William Piner.
Well, thank you, Dr. Karen Forde. I come to you from our home, which rests on the ancestral land of the Nooksack people. I congratulate the editors who've assembled these two important collections, books that will be studied by students and faculty alike. Having assembled and edited a number of books myself, I know how challenging such timely, theoretically important works can be. The challenge starts with formulating the reason for undertaking the work, identifying the key concept or concepts that not only organize the books internally, but bring crucial concepts to colleagues and students. Even after these concepts are determined, the practical professional challenge of choosing the appropriate contributors begins. Once those decisions are made and the invitations are issued, the project is complicated by individual contributors' prior publishing commitments and ongoing institutional obligations like teaching, committee service, pressure from administrators to seek external funding, while trying all the while to keep alive one's intellectual life and the current project undertaken. In the midst of this maelstrom, there is the process of agreeing on due dates, often dates that can pass almost unnoticed as contributors' prior commitments and present institutional obligations take precedence, delaying the overall project and placing the editors in potentially awkward positions of encouraging completion of published chapters that threaten to overburden and even irritate contributors. Such is the multidimensional subtext of assembling and editing collections such as these, an undertaking not to be taken on lightly. Again, my congratulations to Ehaab and Ted. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Bill. Next, we'll hear from our editors, Ehaab and Ted. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piner, and thank you very much, Dr. Ford, for the kind introductions. It's a real pleasure to be joining all of you, and I just wanted to share a few notes to a few thank yous, as well as, and then I'll hand it over to Ted, my wonderful co-editor, to share to remind us all of the key questions that we and the key aims, as Dr. Piner remind us what is the goal in formulating that. And then I'll just briefly highlight the 3 or 4 key recommendations that came out of these 2 volumes. And then it'll be time to hear from 4 of our wonderful and inspiring contributors. So I hope to be doing that in a few minutes. I'll put the timer on because I am known to go a bit over time. So I will not do that because I'm very keen on hearing from our wonderful presenters as well as having time for questions and answers. So welcome everyone. I just want to start with gratitude. So gratitude for the land I'm joining you here from today, the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe and Neutral people in southern Ontario and Turtle Island. Gratitude for the indigenous peoples of this land who have tended and cared for it for millennia, but also, and very much in the spirit of these two edited volumes, also taking a moment to recognize the historical and contemporary injustices that have been endured by indigenous peoples of Turtle Island as well as other parts of the world. So may these edited volumes and may we all continue to our efforts in reconciling and moving ahead with also learning from many of the rich teachings and contributions of indigenous peoples around the world. I want to start by thanking Professor William Piner, not only for his ongoing support pre this project, but also as editor of this the series of studies in curriculum theory series in the Routledge, as well as the very kind, helpful, and encouraging forward that he kindly wrote for the Americas edited volume. I also we'd like to thank Professor George Sefade of Özge, who kindly wrote the forward for the Africa and Eurasia edited volume. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us today. Of course, all our wonderful chapter contributors, some of whom are with us today. Also, our reviewers, and we have some of them with us today, including Professor Jeremy Jimenez from sunny Cortland, and authors of the endorsements who've kindly written some very generous endorsements as well as Sarah Best, the PhD candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University, for all her support with editing and copy editing the two edited volumes. She's done a great job, and we're very grateful for that. And of course, the hosts of this and the past book launches we've been lucky to have. I'll hand it over to Ted to share the coming few slides, including about the objective or the key aim of the edited volumes, as well as a couple of images he wanted to also share with you. Please go ahead, Ted.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see everybody. I'm glad to be here. Bill, thank you for the introduction. Ehaab, thank you for the introduction. Bill, you got me thinking about your words. They're very inspirational, and this is the second volume that I've co-edited with somebody. I want to give the credit to the authors. The editing, of course, it's a lot of work. Sometimes it feels like more administrative work, but the creative and the intellectual exercise really comes out from the authors. And Ehaab and I saw that. And we saw that in the chapters that there was a passion about what the authors were writing about. And I'm one who believes that if you're passionate about something, you produce really good work. And that's what we saw in these edited volumes. That sort of passion did come out in what they were writing about. So one of the other great things about doing an edited volume, especially with global themes, is having the opportunity to work with seasoned and new scholars from around the world. And this is really refreshing, especially during the current times when we feel that we're becoming more and more isolationist. So this is a great opportunity to sort of share differences, but also realize how much similarities we also have as human beings and people that reside on this planet. So that's what I wanted to start off by saying. So Ehaab's going to talk more about the nuances of the organization and of the chapters and the contributors, but 39 scholars from around the world contributed to these two volumes, and more than 10 nations are covered in these volumes. When we came up with this idea with Ehaab, what really we wanted to do was argue that curricula often perpetuates exclusionary discourses that marginalize specific cultures and histories, often portraying indigenous and ancient non-Abrahamic beliefs with skepticism and with antagonism. We challenge the conventional narratives within religious studies, noting how traditional interpretations of the Bible, Torah, and Quran have sometimes cast non-Abrahamic traditions as divergent and not worth learning or understanding about. The volumes ultimately advocate for more holistic and balanced frameworks that validate diverse cultural and spiritual heritages, which invariably enrich students' perspectives about history, culture, and even spirituality. But before Ehaab delves into the chapters and the great work that everybody did to contribute to this, I want everyone to step away for a moment from the theoretical aspects of these and let's look at more about the everyday. Let's take a few seconds and think to ourselves if we've ever had an ancestor who wasn't part of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, or even we could say Buddhism and Hinduism or any other major religion. We should ask ourselves, how long were these ancestors participating in their religions and these traditions before they adopted another religious tradition? Let's also ask ourselves, what have we lost, or what traces of these indigenous faiths can still be found within our modern day religions? This is sort of the genesis of the question that we were sort of asking ourselves when Ehaab and I were bouncing off ideas, right? We're sort of a speck, right now of sort of what the trajectory of history is. I was doing this presentation with another group of people at my own university, and somebody brought up that over the course of history, 100 billion people have walked this earth. To me, that's a fascinating number. 100 billion people. There's currently about 8 billion people in the world. So look at what what traditions these people practice, what their stories were like. And we really don't know much about it. We still haven't really explored a lot of this. So looking at the sort of historical trajectory in the last 2,000 years, we can say the major religions of the world, right? What was happening before that time? What were these people? What were some of these traditions, and how were these traditions shaped, albeit the geography they were in, where they lived, what surrounded them, and so on and so forth. In an earlier study on Greece and Egypt that Ehaab and I did, we found that among the key reasons that many ancient Egyptians converted to Christianity and why we find such prominence of the Virgin Mary in the Coptic Orthodox Church is due to the prominence of the goddess Isis and her large numbers of believers in Egypt and throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Both the ancient Egyptian deity Isis and the Virgin Mary were key mother figures who sought to protect their sons from those who wished to do them harm. Given that pagan worship was only outlawed in the 5th century CE, it could be argued that the switch in devotion from Isis to Mary was never consciously made, at least not on the popular level. Ehaab, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Similarly, in Greece, the Virgin Mary is often connected to the goddess Athena, Parthenos, which means virgin, or the virgin goddess. We even have cases in Greece as late as the 19th century, late 19th century, the people still going to the temple of Athena in Eleusis, right outside of Athens, and praying to the goddess Athena. I'm going to switch it over now to Ehaab.
Thank you very much, Ted. So lots of food for thought. I'll just share a couple of slides about maybe the key recommendations that emerged from the 8th volume from, as Ted just mentioned, all the inspiration, all the rich analysis that came from various parts of the world, including our wonderful chapter contributors who are with us today. We came up with a few recommendations that we thought were common calls to action vis-a-vis some of the questions that we were looking at. So as you all know, and as Ted touched on, our key guiding questions were, how do national school textbooks and curricula portray a nation's historical and perhaps extinct in many cases non-Abrahamic wisdom tradition, including as in cases such in Egypt and Greece and others, as many will be hearing about, and its religious beliefs and practices. And also, how do perhaps maybe some of the living non-Abrahamic religious beliefs and traditions, including indigenous wisdom traditions, as we will hear from our wonderful colleague Frank Deer. And in some cases, some chapters touched on how do these textual constructions and representations shape citizens' worldviews and attitudes, including their relationship and their ability to reconcile or not with some of these ancient or indigenous wisdom traditions. The edited volumes are organized as follows. For each, we had about 9 chapter contributions. I'm highlighting here, we'll be hearing from Özge, touching on the chapter that she and Ilbe wrote about Turkey, and this is the list of the other chapters that that appear in the Eurasia and Africa edited volume. These are the contexts that were covered for the Africa and Eurasia volume: Afghanistan, Albania, Greece, Iran, South Africa, Sweden, Turkey, and Zimbabwe. For the Americas one, we've had also some excellent contributions from across Turtle Island, especially, and we see here the highlighted. We'll be hearing from Frank Deer, Alice Chang, Crystena Parker-Shandal, as well as Rafael on the 3 great chapters that they wrote as part of this edited volume. This covers Turtle Island, modern-day Canada, Puerto Rico, and USA, as well as a wonderful chapter on the CARICOM, or the Caribbean community. The key recommendations, I'll just go through this very quickly before I hand it over to our dear Kieran to introduce our chapter presentations. So the key recommendations, 4 key recommendations emerged from our analysis. Some of it might sound obvious, and some of it might be good reminders for all of us. We're putting those as important recommendations for ministries of education, as well as curriculum developers, policymakers, K-12 educators, and perhaps more importantly for teacher educators as well. The first one that emerged was the need for more inclusive and balanced curricular representations. And this we unpack into a few things, including drawing on the language from the call for actions in the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, inclusion of historical and existing indigenous wisdom traditions in their own right and using their own language, terminologies, worldviews. More balanced representations of religious conversions, ancient encounters and conversions, as well as more recent encounters and conversions, including perhaps religious-based violence and so on, which we rarely hear about in any curricula in any of these contexts. Acknowledgements of exchanges with and ancient and continued influences on the Abrahamic tradition, including some of what Ted highlighted, which we also hear very little about in curricula across the world. The second recommendations is around supporting teachers as well as students in K-12 classrooms, providing more and better historical contextualization and critical textual analysis. And this we unpack into at least 2 areas. One, the ability and the skill to historicize religious scriptures and to put them in context, because we know that a lot of decontextualized drawing on religious scriptures has justified and continues to justify exclusion, violence, and so on. Critical engagements with constructions and reception of myths, religious and historical narratives. We know that a lot of students who might not be exposed to some of these historical methods in the classroom might revert from the dominant narrative to equally exclusionary, faith-based or other types of narratives outside of the classroom if they're not well trained to critically engage with constructions of myths, religious or various historical narratives. The third area is the need for developing supplementary educational resources, as well as better connections with community organizations, elders, and community keepers, knowledge keepers. We'll hear more about that from our various speakers, including from our dear Alice and Crystena, who've done a lot of that in their chapter. And finally, proactive critical engagement with dominant ideologies and constructs. These include 3 key areas. starting with finding ways to critically engage with dominant discourses, ideologies, and worldviews, and how those shape K-12 curricular content, teacher education, and classroom practices. Continued unpacking of dominant constructions of hierarchies of concepts that are normalized, such as civilization. And here we draw on our wonderful Indigenous scholar, Blair Stonechild, who wrote about trying to deconstruct civilization as a construct, and which in its own definition negates and undermines other ways of knowing and being, including perhaps nomadic or oral tradition, and so on. Critically engaging with normalized understandings, including of the nature of time and history. If we only look at history as linear, then many of these wisdom traditions come to naturally be seen as perhaps the less evolved, the primitive, the earlier, less evolved versions of wisdom traditions or civilization or history, as opposed to cyclical, which is, as we know in many indigenous and ancient wisdom traditions, is the way perhaps of seeing the world. So at least introducing students to these various ways of knowing and being, including of the nature of time and history. And finally, I just want to highlight that many of our wonderful chapter contributors and partners have also helped co-found the World Education Research Association's International Research Network on Ancient and Indigenous Histories and Wisdom Traditions. You're all more than welcome, anyone who's interested, to join us. And we have an upcoming global forum as well that highlights, that is a space to celebrate and highlight some of the inspiring efforts happening across the world in bringing in more balanced and inclusive representations of some of these traditionally marginalized histories and wisdom traditions. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to email us, and I will, these are the emails for myself and for Ted. Thanks again very much, and I'll hand it over to Kieran.
Thank you, Ted and Ehaab, for the introduction to these editions. Next, we'll hear from some scholars about their chapters in each of the books. Firstly, regarding ancient and indigenous wisdom traditions in the Americas, Frank Deere and Rebecca Heringer's contribution was entitled Morality and Indigenous Knowledge, Exploring Canadian Educational Contexts. We'll hear it this morning from Frank. Over to you.
Nyagoa, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I really need to offer a very significant Nyagoa. Thank you very much in my language to Ehaab and Ted for their leadership in this project. And it comes at a time when, at least in my realm, explorations of, let's call it wisdom traditions, are becoming more and more prominent within educational circles, at least in my area of study and work. So it's really exciting to have this initiative take place. You mentioned Blair Stonechild a moment ago, who's not with us in the meeting, but I've drawn so much from his work. He has more of a philosophical orientation than I study. I'm a recovering teacher, but I'm also one who spends a great deal of time in Indigenous communities and schools, and that's where this comes from, this chapter and some of the elements of it. So if you read through that, maybe some of what I'll say will ring true. Look, I'm in a time of reconciliation. We're in a time of reconciliation, we're told, in Canada. And I think there was a working title for this book called Reconciling Ancient and Indigenous Wisdom Traditions. That's changed a bit. But I think the term reconciliation might be quite fitting right now. It was the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the late Senator Murray Sinclair, who said that reconciliation is the journey towards a new relationship amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, whilst retaining a sense of the past, the shared past, one that has been traumatic for many, and was centered on the school experience. And religion, spirituality were areas of concern and continue to be in regard to those experiences. I come from Gatnawage, which is just south of Tiohtià:ke. Someone mentioned in the chat that they're also from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, if you will. In my language, Tiohtià:ke can be said to mean something like where the rivers meet or where the currents converge, if you know where Montreal is and the two rivers meet to the St. Lawrence. to the north. And I I grew up in Ganawage, a bit different from a public school experience insofar as that the indigenous spiritual orientations were resident in what we did on a daily basis. That included something really quite interesting. Whilst many, all those years ago in the 80s, were beginning school with the Lord's Prayer and such, we began with something that we called the Ahanda Gariwadekwa, which I suppose can be understood to mean words that become all else, that come before all else. And it is can be understood to be something you recite, although we do find ourselves amending it every so often, right? And it was something, and it was a challenge for the kids. It was a competition. Who got to speak? Who got to recite the Ahondagari Wadekwa at the beginning of every day? Of course, if you knew the language well, you were sort of the subject of focus by the teachers who included you in those proceedings, right? I once asked a former teacher back in Ganawage, because understand that the Catholic faith is quite strong in Ganawage as well. And English was and still is the principal language in that area. And understanding the religious experience, even the spiritual experience, to a large extent extends on to the Christian Catholic experience as well. So that led me to ask somebody a question about the Ahondagari Wadekwa. I asked a former teacher, he's passed now, his name was Jaragwate, that this thing that we do every day, the Ahondagari Wadekwa, is that a prayer? And he answered very tersely and directly. He said, no, we don't beg, we give thanks. And that sort of just, I didn't know what to do with that at the time. But as time passed and I get older, the distinction matters. The difference between attempting to create some connection with a higher power and, on the other hand, being thankful for all we have, all that has been created. There's a difference there that really is quite significant, and an orientation associated with it that really is quite important. And that sort of led me down this path of coming to understand what the differences are, if there were, and it seems there are, between the spiritual wisdom traditions, let's call them, of the Ungwehue, First Peoples in my language, and those who are not Ungwehue, okay? And I didn't enter this as an area of study. I entered it as one who was interested in language education. I wanted to study with communities how language was brought to life, how it was resident in the journey of self-affirmation and identity celebration for Indigenous peoples. Maybe some of you have experienced something like this. When you ask people in Indigenous communities of whatever sort about something like language or educational experiences, how often does the conversation turn towards religion and spirituality? In my case, I don't think there was an experience I've had where it didn't become a central aspect of it. Didn't matter what we're talking about, curriculum, language, as I'd mentioned, treaty education, which is a big thing in many parts of Canada. When you're speaking to community members, it became clear that what mattered to them was the spiritual orientations resident in their people. Morality, and perhaps the ethical journey as well, was also a very important part of that. On the prairies and perhaps elsewhere, the seven grandfather teachings are an important guiding tool for people. It's one example, I assure you there are others, for which the moral journey is resonant, even if not nominally. So it was really important to come to confront what this concern was and how it might map on to contemporary education. So again, I'm really excited for what Ehaab and Ted have served up for us here. And it comes at a time when I mentioned reconciliation as a journey for people in schools, public schools in particular. That means that they're concerned with how they minister to the needs of Indigenous peoples and communities. So they're experiencing what I experienced. You bring in Indigenous communities and peoples, and these school districts, division schools are asking, what would you like for us in the educational journey of your children? And how can we help with that? Ceremony is a frequently cited aspect of that. The spiritual and religious experience of our peoples is a central aspect to that. It's almost become a proxy for understanding the Indigenous experience for many. Um, and now, and I don't want to make it sound like all schools are doing the same thing or are at the same point in the journey, but many continue to invite Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers into their schools, not just to offer a brief beginning to an event or such, but actually engage with students and community about the moral journey, about how relationships are adequately and suitably established amongst Indigenous people, Ungwehua, and across cultures. So that's been a really important aspect. I think it was Ehaab who mentioned the phrase religious violence earlier, and that we don't talk about it. I don't think I've experienced much of that in a terribly significant way. But we are still in a place where we're still coming to understand our relationship with each other and in an ostensibly secular school system, right? One quick example. I was a part of a committee in one school district that was confronting the need to sort of invite Indigenous peoples and community into the school for the sake of having some sort of school experience that students can learn from. So a cultural event was hosted with some external folk coming into the community, including an Indigenous dance troupe of young people, 12 to 14 years old, coming into the school to sort of share their art with the students. And what the school wished to do, what some number of people in the school wished to do, was make a traditional offering, which is close to the spiritual experience, offering tobacco. Very important. I would be looked upon with a raised eyebrow if I didn't offer tobacco. But what's the level of analysis for administrators in the school? Wait, you're giving tobacco to 14-year-old children? No, we're not going to do that. So that caused the sort of rift. So it's not the sort of violence that Ehab you're mentioning, but it's sort of the disconnect that we're trying to reconcile, as you've spoken about in your opening comments. Our frames are important to us, if I may finish on this point. They help guide us. They help us to understand our orientations towards people. And the word that we have back home for a creator is Sunkwayatdism. You may refer to that as the creator, a higher deity, if you will, right? And although we don't, I would say, pray to Sunkwayatdism, what we do is we orientate ourselves to an idea of what this being is and how our journeys might be associated with the stories we know and share about Sunkwayatdism, about the spiritual journeys of our ancestors. And that's led for some really fruitful conversations with my fellow community members. And there's only one aspect of this journey that I've shared in the chapter along with Rebecca Herringer, who I don't think she's with us today. So that's the journey in a nutshell for me in developing this chapter. And it's one that's not finished. The curricular issues are not without their challenges, as I've mentioned earlier. But I think, some are confronting what I think it was Habermas did all those years ago in that text, an awareness of what's missing If you read the book, he entered a ceremony for the passing of a colleague, and he came to confront what was missing, not necessarily um, an essentialization of the religious experience, but something was missing for him. I invite you to read it if you've not already. Um, for many of my fellow Ngwahua, something is, and I'm really happy for Ehaab and Ted for their leadership to at least begin this conversation. And I'm really excited for the future interfaces that we may have on this topic. Nyaogoa, thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank, so much for your share. I can tell already I'm going to have to go back and listen to that. That line, is that a prayer? We don't beg, we give thanks. That's heavy stuff. Thank you so much for that. Next, we have Alice Chan and Crystena Parker-Shandal. Their contribution to the volume was entitled Curricula or Local Relationships and Knowledge. What is the chicken and which is the egg? I hope they'll be able to answer that for us today. Over to you.
Thank you. I think our presentation will follow nicely from yours, Frank. So thank you for all that you shared. This chapter written by Alice and I, Alice has definitely took the lead on this in terms of amazing contributions and ideas for this chapter. So I'm Crystena, and I'm a associate professor at Renison University College at the University of Waterloo, and here with amazing Alice.
Hi, Crystena. Thank you so much for those kind words. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's great to be in this space and have this conversation with you all. I am Alice. I'm the one who is based in Chokchoge, Frank, in Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory here. And what we are going to share with you is really a conversation that Crystena and I had as also educators. We were classroom teachers, and our lives and most of our training and teaching has been in the province of Ontario in Canada. And so you'll see that a lot of this conversation and all the focus is in the context of Ontario, but we really ask a question that we had ourselves, and the chapter kind of unfolds what we find along the way, documents the conversation and what we found, to this big question of, what comes first when it comes to teaching? Should we focus on the curriculum first, or is it relationship building? Which one truly advances reconciliation? And that was our big question. But the quick and short answer for you today is that curriculum alone is not enough. That's what we found. And so what we did in our chapter was we examined the FNMI in Ontario curriculum. That's the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, so the 3 Indigenous groups in Canada, curriculum around these groups. We examined the Ontario curriculum and tried to really weigh what is the curriculum saying versus what are we hearing in terms of relationships, what should we focus on? And we really asked all of these, again, based on our role as educators. What does this mean for us and others who are teaching in Toronto or Ontario overall? And we found that this work requires humility and responsibility in engaging deeper into the conversation. And in our chapter, why we said this matters, and what we're sharing with you today is that in Canada, we are working on reconciliation. In our chapter, when we first wrote this, we used the term post-reconciliation, and Crystena and I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I don't know if it's post anymore. I feel like, sadly, a lot of reconciliation work needs to continue and will for a long time, because in Canada and many pockets of Canada, people are even questioning, and still questioning, or questioning even more, did residential schools actually happen? Mass graves, children, were they, really buried in mass graves? These conversations still persist and sadly are growing in parts of Canada, or louder than they were before. So I feel like this first point about this fragile moment, it's pressing. It's still very important, the conversation that we're sharing today, because the TRC, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, and Jordan's principle that calls for equal access to healthcare for all children in Canada, including Indigenous children. All of these have made calls for action, need for change, for to challenge a systemic discrimination that continues to face Indigenous peoples. Yes, in the education system, but we also see it in many parts of Canadian spaces as well. But for our focus, we will focus on education today because we understand as educators really the importance of education and how it shapes worldviews.
Thanks, Alice. And yeah, I think before we spend a bit more time talking about curriculum, we wanted to just briefly speak to the system that it lives in. So within the context of Canada, residential schools ran for over 160 years and with a sole purpose to erase Indigenous cultures. And leaders in Ontario have helped to design that system. And those ideas have really shaped public education today. And I think it's really important to think about that this isn't ancient history, as you know, as we think about schooling today, because all of this deeply affects young children's lives today across Canada. And the harm, the intergenerational trauma really didn't stop when residential schools closed. And there was a 60s scoop in Canada that continued to separate Indigenous children from their families. And again, today we still see the impact. You have higher rates of Indigenous children in child welfare, the justice system that is incredibly inequitable, and tragic rates of suicide. So for educators that are in the classroom attempting to talk about these issues, it means that, you know, when thinking about reconciliation, it's not just a sole lesson plan. It's really a commitment to healing and relationships that have to go hand in hand with this work. And as Alice shared earlier, the TRC, the MMIWG inquiry, Jordan's principle, it all shows us that these harms are part of a long-standing institutional pattern, and they all say the same thing. The education needs to change, and it's not just what we teach, but how we teach, and importantly, how we hold ourselves accountable in doing this work. So the real question really becomes, can curriculum alone shift attitudes that took generations to build? Probably not, but something deeper is really desperately needed.
So in our exploration and our chapter, what we chose to do to dig deeper into this context, the role of educators, and what we could use as educators in terms of curriculum and a place where we can make change through curriculum was curriculum analysis. That's where we started. We wanted to see what is written in the Ontario curriculum right now. We then wanted to hear about personal reflections from different educators. And we wanted to understand what is in the curriculum pre-2015 when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was published, and then has anything changed post the publication of that report. And we focused primarily on public schools, the non-Catholic public school systems in Ontario, because those are in many ways considered more neutral because there's no teaching of any particular faith. And so we really looked at all of these details and grounded our approach in considering the time, comfort, and limited relationships that teachers also have. What can teachers actually do? And so when we looked at the pre-TRC curriculum, we noticed that there is inclusion of Indigenous spirituality, but in limited ways. For example, World Religions curriculum, we found that it asks the non-Indigenous teachers to explain Indigenous spiritual concepts, which means it's included in the curriculum, but we also realize that this contradicts the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call number 48, which really pushes and calls all individuals to support Indigenous self-determination in spiritual teaching. So we noticed as a result that the fact that pre-TRC curriculum included this it has good intentions because Indigenous spirituality is included, but it can cause harm because with lack of understanding, teachers may teach it wrong or in a very simplified, siloed form, perhaps. Thankfully, we did notice that post 2019 or post 2015, when the TRC was published, that the new First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous studies curriculum does include much more with the TRC in mind. And so there are 10 interdisciplinary courses that are grounded in identity, land, treaty relationships, governance, and stewardship that's included in there, discusses it from these angles. And there is more guidance to partner with Indigenous communities. But we noticed that while this is an important progress, it was still insufficient on its own.
And we're seeing school boards take action. Like there's advisory councils and Indigenous leadership roles, and obviously they are good steps, but building a committee is really much easier than building trust. And without coming back to the title of the talk, it's without real relationships, these structures really do stay symbolic instead of meaningful. And as Alice was saying, most teachers actually, they do want to do this work, but they feel unprepared. And for many teachers, they actually haven't been taught the history themselves. And they worry about saying the wrong thing. Some avoid the topic entirely because they fear either, collegial or potentially parental reprisal. There's, so this tendency to steer away from controversy, even though it's necessary for truth telling. And the result is that reconciliation becomes optional. It's inconsistent and often left out altogether. And in this past term, my first year undergrad students, a lot of them spoke about courses they took about Indigenous education in high school, where teachers weren't Indigenous themselves, had little to no knowledge themselves about the topic, and really presented things in such a neutralized, genericized way that they themselves, as someone who was learning about the topic, felt that it was doing much more harm than good.
Yeah, so with these observations and our continued questions, Crystena and I decided to reach out to friends of ours. So Dr. Joanna Bird, who's now at the University of Manitoba, and then we also reached out to Dr. Blair Stonechild to ask them both, who is at the First Nations University in Regina, and he's also one of the authors in a chapter in this book. We asked them both, okay, this is what we found. What are your thoughts? Can you give us some insight? How do you, what are we missing here? And they showed and really helped us understand that there is more and more Indigenous knowledge and curriculum being created, available in certain provinces, for example, Saskatchewan, and then in informal, outside of school contexts as well. And they really highlighted to us to recognize how important it is to see that this new curriculum, new to us, non-Indigenous people like Crystena and myself, that this curriculum is not a response to the gap in traditional Canadian education system of excluding Indigenous knowledge and content, but really it is knowledge and education that the communities are creating themselves. In that way, it is important for us to recognize the sense of independence, the sense of agency, and the sense of I can't think of the word right, sovereignty of their own knowledge and their own systems, and learning from that. And to really see that this is not a reactive response, that Ontario curriculum, the gaps that exist there, and areas for improvement, but really it's something that they're doing on their own. And in this way, as we learn more about it and see it, it's important for us to recognize the holistic and relational approach and the depth of Indigenous knowledge that's out there, which is why relationships are so important, because it shapes the real learning, and presents a completely different worldview than we as non-Indigenous people are familiar with. Yeah, this is a really important point, and I might have missed something. So Crystena, please feel free to add. Yeah.
No, I think you covered it so beautifully, Alice. And yeah, just in the interest of trying to get through quickly, because I know we have two other amazing chapter contributors, but just to summarize and just to think more about what Alice was saying, which was so important, is that, you know, reconciliation is about people. It's about the relationships. It's not paperwork. It's not like a checklist. So, you know, we can have the best curriculum in the world, but without relationships, humility and guidance from local Indigenous voices, we risk causing more harm. So, you know, as Alice has, you know, many beautiful relationships with elders that were part of this chapter in terms of representing their voices. And as we go through this learning with, you know, youth and communities, our teaching ultimately does change. But I think with that, so does our understanding of responsibility. And I think that's where the real transformation starts.
Thank you, Crystena. And maybe if you're okay with it, Crystena, we'll just leave it here for the sake of time. And if anybody has questions, of course, check out the chapter, but we'd be happy to answer questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Alice and Crystena, for the overview and the compelling invitation to engage with the chapter and the themes therein. Next, we'll hear from authors from the edition Ancient and Indigenous Wisdom Traditions in African and Euro-Asian Contexts. Firstly, we'll hear from Rafael Capo. His contribution was entitled The Coloniality of Social Studies and History Textbooks in Puerto Rico, Portrayals of Taino Religious Beliefs and Spanish Colonial Conquests. Raf?
Thank you, Kieran. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen quickly here. Okay. Is that good?
Yes, sir.
Good. Okay, so greetings. I think along the way and today, I've realized that I came to this edited volume because of my interest in textbook studies rather than Indigenous epistemologies and Indigenous ways of knowing, which is not to say that you know, anything less or more, just that my approach is or my interest comes more about narratives, right? More about textbooks as mediums of knowledge production and narrativity. So I was a public school teacher in Puerto Rico for 7 years before I did my PhD at UBC's Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy. That's the University of British Columbia. So I have firsthand experience with many of the textbooks and narratives that I analyze in my research. In my chapter, I argue that even when Puerto Rican social studies and history textbooks critique colonialism, slavery, and Eurocentrism, they do so from within Eurocentrism itself. They mostly fail to question colonization and Christianity by embracing the discourse of harmonious mestizaje or miscegenation, which you can see in the image here, the combination of different races that give rise, right, to the new nation. In the case of the Americas, this is a narrative that's seen in most countries of Latin America. Textbooks oversimplify Indigenous ways of knowing and project them as palatable forms of folklore that constitute one of the roots in the holy trinity of Puerto Rican identity, the mixture of the Indigenous Taino, the white Spaniard, and the African Negro. Their treatment of history and Indigenous ways of knowing strengthens the coloniality of power, while in my research I identified numerous themes surrounding the portrayal of Indigenous Taino religion. I'm going to focus mostly on one of them, and I'll let you know soon which one. The theoretical framework I used is very much informed by Aníbal Quijano's Coloniality of Power, which posits that even after political independence, Latin America is still subsumed within Eurocentric epistemologies that reproduce hierarchies of race, class, sexuality, gender, and spirituality. Textbooks offer an important medium from which to analyze the colonial power and how it manifests itself in school curricula. I'm also heavily influenced by the work of Edouard Glissant. I heard someone mention the idea of relationality, the previous presenter, so I'm also very much influenced in that, but I'm not going to go much into detail here, but in the chapter I do. I analyze 13 textbooks in total. 9 of the 13 are primary and secondary level textbooks published by the 4 biggest publishing companies that operate in Puerto Rico: Santillana, Panamericana, Publicaciones Educativas, and Ediciones EM. I name these books and I reference them. I include them in the bibliography because my work is also focused on creating curricular change. So it's really important to name the publishing houses to attempt, right, so that my scholarship can also produce improvements in the curriculum. Of these 9, 3 are primary level textbooks, and the rest are secondary level textbooks. I also analyzed 3 additional books that were published primarily for introductory college level courses, though they have also been used in upper grades of certain private schools. And I also looked at the COVID-19 2020 modules that were used at that time to see if there was any similarities with the textbooks. So the findings of my research point to the subtle ways Eurocentrism seeps into the epistemological framework of the curriculum. Even when some of the textbooks I analyze critique colonialism and Eurocentrism, they do so from within a Eurocentric conception of history. First, the majority of textbooks I reviewed discuss Taíno, the indigenous peoples of Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, mostly the greater Caribbean, the Jamaica, Santo Domingo, La Española, Cuba. They discussed the Taíno cosmology with a problematic sense of absolute certainty that ignores history and archaeology's interpretive nature. This is what I call epistemic certainty. Second, they deterministically present colonialism and its repercussions as inevitable processes. This is what I call epistemic determinism. They were inevitable. It had to happen, right? And third, they exculpate the colonial project by isolating blame on exceptional scapegoats, which is what I'm going to focus on in this brief presentation. These are all maneuvers of simplification that reproduce palatable narrative templates. This is I'm citing James Wersch. And these narrative templates of the Taínos strengthen their inclusion into the national archetype of Puerto Rican identity, a depoliticized and romanticized harmonious mixture of 3 races whose unifying ethos can only be accomplished through uncritical epistemic acceptance of an official multicultural national identity. So the first one, and the only one I'm really going to discuss is the idea of this epistemic scapegoating. But before that, I just want to mention that all we know of the indigenous peoples of the Taínos comes from one book. The book is the one you're seeing here, a Catalan priest, a friar who lived in La Española, who met the Taínos, who translated their knowledges, their cosmology, and that's the only source. So when I say that it's problematic how sure the books sound when they discuss these cosmologies, it's because we have absolutely no way of really knowing that this is what they believed. And we also strip the indigenous peoples of their right to opacity, of their right to not be known, right? Because the textbook needs to know. It needs to turn them into a more palatable, understandable community. So, but what I want to first focus on this idea of scapegoating is that every textbook I discuss, I discuss the encomienda system, which is a sort of enslavement system for the indigenous peoples. This system was instituted to organize forced labor on the Caribbean islands. Taínos were distributed to conquistadors to carry out construction, mining, and agricultural duties. The Spaniards, on the other hand, had the moral obligation of dressing, protecting, and Christianizing their indigenous subjects. Every textbook draws attention to the abuses and shortcomings. This is why I say, like, all the textbooks critique, right? There was abuses and shortcomings of the encomienda system, but only a handful critique the system itself as a racist and ethnocentric project. Most of the textbooks critique the encomienda system by arguing that it was perhaps not correctly implemented, instead of critiquing its racist ethos of the system itself. Right, and this also happens with slavery, right, and this idea of a benevolent slavery, right, specifically right now during the Trump administration, at least in the U.S. Here's an example of one of the textbooks. In the majority of the cases, the work of the encomienda left little time for the teaching of the Christian faith, and for many encomenderos, the extraction of gold was more important than the teaching of the Christian faith. The critique of the book here is not that the encomienda system was wrong. is that it left little time for Christianity, right? That's the shortcoming. That's the critique this primary elementary textbook is sort of providing students. Here's another example. This is a secondary level. The desire of initiating the Indians in the Christian faith, of educating and offering them housing, food, and clothing in exchange for their labor, which consisted of working in the extraction of gold and the construction of houses, harvesting of fields. But this purpose was initially distorted, and the Spanish reduced the Indians to a state of semi-slavery, which decidedly influenced their rebellion. Again, this idea that it was distorted. It was well-intentioned in the beginning. They were going to treat them well, introduce the correct faith that they should follow. They were going to dress them, civilize them. But some people preferred to extract gold, and they abused the rest. Another example, through the encomienda, the Spanish were tasked with the custody of several Taínos. The encomendero was committed to protecting them, providing them clothing, and teaching them the Christian faith. In exchange, the Indian would work the land, the mines. Some encomenderos, only some, that's key here, some encomenderos exploited the Indians, right? The system itself did not exploit the Taínos. Only some bad apples, right? They separated them from their towns and their traditional activities. They took their wives and daughters and they exposed them to the diseases they brought from Europe. So again, there is some critique here. It's just the critique is not of the system itself. It's a couple of people who distorted the well-intentioned system. This idea, this framing of indigenous cosmologies and scapegoating of violence is also part of the Puerto Rican national narrative of the three races, this depoliticized view that we come from three races, the Spaniard in the middle, the African to the right, and to the left, the indigenous Taino, who harmoniously, consensually came together in love and harmony, right? And that's been fed to us. In every textbook, that is the narrative that sort of prevails throughout. One phenomenon that I found in most books is that every time they spoke of the encomienda, the semi-slavery, right? They immediately spoke of Friar Bartolomé Las Casas, the famous friar who defended the Taínos. They immediately speak of those within Christianity and those within Spain who protected the Taínos, right? So the idea is the abuses, the violence, but here are the heroes of the story, those who came from within the church to protect them. And the same thing happens with slavery. In every textbook, when they discuss African slavery, immediately following that come the abolitionists, the white abolitionists, those who struggled to fight against slavery, right? So the idea is that slavery was invented to be immediately abolished. The encomienda was invented, and then immediately it was fought against, right? So that's sort of, I wanted to be very brief in sharing the findings. It's a longer chapter. I invite you all to check it out. And I'm really happy I undertook this opportunity early on in my graduate studies. It's led me to continue publishing on textbook studies. And I never thought I'd be writing about textbooks, but they're pretty interesting, actually. So thank you very much, Ehaab. And forgive me, I forget, and Ted for editing the volume, and everyone for contributing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafa. Finally, Özge Karakus Özdemirci'm and İlbi Özdemirci'm's contribution was entitled "What Has Been Lost? Tracing the Religious Diversity of Anatolia Over Discourses in Contemporary Secondary Education Curriculum in Turkey." Özge, over to you.
Thank you, Kieran. And I'll start the presentation first. Sorry. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, great chapter contributors. It was really great to listen again of your work. And thank you, Ehaab and Ted, for editing this volume. It was, for me, it was really a great journey. It provided me really a deeper critical space to think on the concept of diversity, because as a researcher who works on citizenship education curriculum, I used to think only the existing cultures and religions, and while thinking about the concept of diversity within the context of Turkey. But after actually meeting with Ehaab and being a part of this great volumes, I also started to think about the existed cultures, once lived cultures in Anatolia, actually. So it provides me really a deeper critical space. So I'm going to present our piece titled that What Has Been Lost, Tracing the Religious Diversity of Anatolia over Discourses in Contemporary Secondary Education Curriculum of Turkey. I will also present on behalf of İlbey. He cannot join today. So, however, before starting, I would like to explain the meaning of the pictures. You will see some pictures actually throughout the presentation, and I would like to explain the meaning of them. So these pictures belongs to Hagia Sophia, which is located in Istanbul and was once a Christian church in the Eastern Roman Empire, and was built on the site of an ancient pagan temple. Also, some ruins from several pagan temples were used during the construction. So I think this is a strong example that shows the syncretism of religions once lived and still live in Anatolia. On the other hand, through James Scott's concept of legibility, this also shows how Istanbul made legible while becoming a part of Ottoman Empire. Then it was a museum from the beginning of the 1930, and finally, again, it became a mosque since 2020. So I think this kind of summarizes our chapter, and I would like to also remind that the piece of Ehaab and Ted in the conversation. I really liked reading their piece on Hagia Sophia. And I can share the link later after the presentation. So I would like to start why we prefer to use Anatolia rather than Turkey. And also, where is Anatolia actually? So in the literature, as the Asia Minor and Anatolia are used synonymously. Anatolia is mainly used to define the region where modern-day Turkey is located. We prefer to use Anatolia in our chapter to trace the region's religious history, not the state. And also we want to understand how Anatolia made legible while Republic of Turkey was built. Anatolia actually is one of the richest religious landscapes in the world history. For more than 10,000 years, it has been a crossroads where belief systems overlapped, interacted, transformed, and coexisted. So from prehistoric animistic rituals to Neolithic cult centers like Göbekli Tepe, which is located in southeastern Anatolia, from Hittite, Phrygian, Luwian, Urartian polytheisms to ancient Judaism, early Christianity, Byzantine Orthodoxy, Armenian and Syriac traditions, and later a wide range of Islamic expressions such as Sunni, Alevi, Shia, Alevi Bektashi, and multiple Sufi orders. So the story of Anatolia is not confined to a single religion, actually. It's a palimpsest of religious layers, we can say. So that's why we wanted to understand how is this diversity represented or silenced in secondary education curriculum, which histories are highlighted, which are lost, which discourses and narratives are used to build Anatolia's religious identity, let's say. And through these questions, we want to understand and discuss how these discourses and narratives contribute to national identity formation of Turkey. And we define our research methodology as a critical qualitative inquiry and a reconceptualized curriculum research, since we attempt to make the inequalities visible by defining curriculum as a political text and a complicated conversation involving culture, politics, and the history. So our data sets consisted of the historic curriculum and 3 textbooks from grade 9, 10, and 11, the Revolution History and Kemalism curriculum and 1 textbook from grade 12, the religious culture and ethics curriculum and 4 textbooks from grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. So 8 out of 14 officially approved textbooks were selected based on several criteria, such as the publisher and grade level. We used critical discourse analysis, particularly the Vienna School's discourse historical approach, because critical discourse analysis allowed us to look not just at content, let's say, not just the explicit messages, but also at discursive strategies, linguistic choices, narrative patterns, and silences. This was essential because identity is often constructed implicitly, not explicitly always. And that's why the assumptions, omissions, and tone was also important for us to analyze. And actually, findings firstly and quite strongly manifested that curriculum and textbooks construct a narrow and hierarchical definition of religion. So they privilege Abrahamic monotheism, especially Islam, delegitimizes polytheistic or animistic beliefs, erases ancient Anatolian religions by refusing to categorize them as religions, and also Islam framed as the ultimate and true religion, which eventually create a hierarchical relationship, actually, which represents a kind of pyramid with Sunni Islam on the top, let's say. And we can also say that Anatolia's past actually was reframed through a selective memory. This is the second key finding. The curriculum reorganizes the past into 2 periods. Pre-Islamic Anatolia is treated superficially, and ancient beliefs are disconnected from modern culture. And also, the arrival of Turks is presented as the moment Anatolia gains its true identity, let's say, with Islamization depicted as natural and positive. And our third key finding manifested that the curriculum and textbooks reinforces the Turk-Islam synthesis. Tengrism is reframed as proto-Islamic. Alevi Shia traditions are either folklorized or marginalized. Islam is introduced as a pillar of the Turkish national identity. It's portrayed as the moral and cultural foundation of Turkishness. Besides the contribution of Turks to the Islamization of Anatolia and its importance for Islam is discursively constructed. And also, we found that that there was a linguistic construction of we versus others. So language kind of constructed a boundary between we refers to Turkish Sunni Muslims and the others. Turk-Islam synthesis is naturalized as the only authentic subject of the nation, reinforced through emotional and possessive language like our religion, our prophet, our culture, our ethics, our buildings, our mosques, our music. So kind of most of the elements of the culture kind of defined through our actual possession. This reinforces perceptions of outsiders and amplifies narratives of threat, we can say. Yeah, this is a part of our title actually. So what has been lost? Anatolia's ancient religious layers and plural memory actually, and also a democratic opportunity to teach students that identities are layered, diverse, and interconnected. The curriculum ultimately presents a homogenized Anatolia rather than the plural and the dynamic one revealed by history. So the losses, we can say, is not only historical but also pedagogical. And what we need is pluralistic teaching approaches which reintegrates Anatolia's diverse heritage and supports coexistence through education, historical and religious knowledge that refers to the rich legacy of Anatolia that we need. And this may provide students an opportunity to accommodate the increasing diversity of the world as well. Thank you for listening, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Özge, and thank you to Frank, Alice, Christina, and Rafael for the overview of your chapters. We are quickly approaching time here, so I'm going to open the floor now for questions. We've got about 10 minutes, so feel free to put your hand up, or you can drop a question in the chat and I can read it with you from there. The floor is open. Ted, you wanted to share something?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the chat mechanism for a moment. Thank you for all the presentations. They were excellent. They got really my wheels turning, really stimulating. Özge, I really liked your presentation. I liked it a lot. And I have a question for you. This is just out of curiosity. I put it in the chat box. But my question is that I've been reading a shift in sort of the origin models of the Turkish people from one that is a sort of quote unquote Turkic origin of the Turkish people because of their language being a Central Asian language, non-European language, to one that's looking more towards a sort of indigenous Anatolian origin of the Turkish people. I'm not sure if you understand my question, but have you seen this shift where there are people in Turkey right now saying that we're really indigenous Anatolian people who sort of adopted a Turkic language later?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I remember that we talked about this before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I don't have. I'm just let me think of it. But I don't have much knowledge on it actually.
So I guess when you were in school learning about Turkish history, was there the way children learned about Turkish history? Was it the idea that the Turkish people were always in Anatolia, or did they originate from somewhere else?
No, they originate from the Middle Asia actually.
Okay, it's from Central
Yeah.
Asia. So
Yeah,
so what I'm
Central
seeing is right now there are scholars saying that their origins are in Anatolia, and it's just that they have adopted a Turkish language later. It would be the same thing as saying that Romanians speak a Roman language. It's not that they're descendants of the Romans, it's just the Romans happened to be there, they set up the institutions and they adopted a Latin-based language in a sea of sort of Slavic languages around them. So I'm just curious because that would have sort of moving to that model from a political standpoint, it would sort of legitimize more that
Yeah.
lands and territories belong to the people that are already there.
Yeah, I was going to say the same actually. So this is kind of making legible the lands actually. It's a kind of a part of nation construction, we can say.
Right. And then that's great. And then for Rafael, again, I have a question for you. So I think I do the textbook research, and I love doing the textbook research because it's as a historian, for me, it's a primary source, right? So automatically you get the primary source, and you sort of view it from the perspective of it gives you a sort of window to how people sort of saw history at the time about the time. So you're talking about the one religious scholar who sort of wrote about the indigenous Taínos, and that's really the only perspective we have about it. What is your, and I only ask this question because it was brought up to me. I was in the Yucatan in Mexico right now, and during Thanksgiving break, and I was talking to some of the indigenous people, and one of them said to me that I'm so glad that we weren't occupied by the sort of English, and we were occupied by the Spanish, because the English would have made us slaves, and the Spanish didn't really make us into slaves. So I guess that relationship is sort of, it opened up a window for me. It's sort of like I never really thought about it that way, but this is how some of the indigenous people sort of see their sort of past and their history and their treatment and their relationship with the sort of Spanish conquistadors or
yeah. So that's I'm glad you asked that. I've seen that a lot in my research, beyond textbooks. In Spain, they have this thing called La Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend, that they argue the British invented, where that framed the Spanish and the Portuguese as the inceptors of slavery, as the inceptors of genocide, as the creators of the disaster that is 1492, and as a decadent empires, right? And they counter that with La Leyenda Blanca, the white legend, where they've systematically, and this has been going on for 2 centuries, or maybe a century, a little more than a century, where they systematically have created and turned the British model of colonization as a model that did not inspire, did not promote mixture, that was more focused on actually displacement and genocide and occupation and all that. And while historically and factually, and we can look at documents and settlement patterns, we can definitely see some of these patterns exist. The issue I have with these conversations is that it usually revolves around saying that one empire did it better than the other, right? That one was less violent than the other. So in these conversations, which also happen, for instance, with slavery, it's always in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean, and in Brazil, they did the same. Gilberto Freire was the master of this, of showing how in Latin races were more prone, because of the Muslim invasion, Islamic invasion, right, or occupation, or whatever you want to call it, because of that, and because of Catholicism, not Protestantism, not other religions, because of that, they were more prone to tolerance, to treat their enslaved people with kindness, to be benevolent, right? While the British, with their Protestant ethic and that sort of mindset, is what sort of motivated and established a more violent regime of labor and a more violent regime of work. So these are all sort of narratives that I compete with today. Like today, I still have to debate with people about, oh, well, thank God we didn't get colonized by the British. And it's still this comparison, But then you tell them, well, the British abolished slavery 50 years before the Spanish. So I don't know what you're talking about, right? So, but it's these conversations that really lead nowhere, but are very much rooted in a historian's obsession to sort of try to categorize and hierarchize evil, if you will.
Yeah, I totally understand your point. Yeah, I could totally. Yeah.
Great.
All right, good. That's great. So it wasn't just this group of people that were expressing this. So this is sort of a general sort of idea that's even in the Caribbean, you've noticed.
And just to add a tiny detail, the fact that Puerto Rico became a U.S. colony magnified the use of Spanish, Latin race sort of narratives as a shield. It turned our Spanish heritage into a shield to defend ourselves from Americanization and U.S. empire in the early
I see what
20th
you're
century.
saying. Because of that, it pulled you closer to that sort of Spanish sort of. I get it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Great. Sorry, I'm going to have to leave now. I have to run, but thank you, everybody. I just wanted to ask my two questions. And sorry if I jumped ahead of somebody, but thank you, Ehaab. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody. Great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ted. I'll skip quickly to another question in the chat there. Stephanie has asked, she says, what I heard from Frank and Crystena and Alice was the importance of relational, somatic, experiential learning in the forms of ceremony and relationship building. This feels like a potential addition to the recommendations shared by Ehaab. Beyond this, I'm curious about the pedagogical strategies for opening students up to animist worldviews. Alice has already weighed in the chat. If Frank, Crystena, Ehaab, or anyone else would like to add, now's your chance.
Only to say that there are some expert teachers in the field right now that I've had the pleasure of. I supervise students in the school, so I get to see this every so often. The importance of yielding a bit to sort of the knowledges that fall outside of the professional orientations of the teacher who's there, right? So, and I don't necessarily just mean inviting elders and knowledge keepers to come in and share, right? But yielding to uh, the knowledges that are resident out there that are not necessarily traditionally being employed to do this. And this has been spoken about by some of the other presenters there, the notion that elders knowledge series that might be sort of available through in the case of Manitoba, the Treaty Relations Commission and such is really quite important. It is a leap of faith, I suppose, to sort of be reposing trust in those resources that haven't necessarily been brought to bear in classrooms. That's really quite important. Reimagining the sources of knowledge that we need in order to sort of achieve something about the Indigenous experience. As Marie Batiste put it, we need to focus upon the unique manifestations of Indigenous knowledge, heritage, and consciousness. And to do that, and I enjoyed the presentation about the textbooks and such in your part of the world, but sometimes this knowledge is resident within the people, within the communities, and that's important to bring to bear.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Frankie. And just to add to what Alice and Frank were saying, I think where we were going with our chapter is really focusing and starting with the relationships. And it could be something as simple as guiding students to notice their connections to land and water and to one another, and thinking about using embodied activities, and listening, stillness, sensory mapping, and overall letting Indigenous voices lead the process as well.
If I may add, maybe just very briefly, thank you, Stephanie, for the question, and definitely a point well taken that this needs to be highlighted a bit more. In recommendation 4, we try to highlight a little bit the importance of embedding and supporting teachers to have more confidence and more comfortable in drawing on community resources, elders, and knowledge keepers. So definitely a very important point, but I think it needs to be a bit more nuanced and highlighted. So thank you for that important reminder. One small addition I would say is also perhaps offering our teachers and in teacher education the tools to be able to engage in their own critical self-reflection to look at blind spots and implicit biases and so on, but also in ways they can bring that to also age-appropriate ways in their classrooms. To help dismantle and help maybe gently challenge some of the constructs, including the idea of civilization, for instance, the idea of pagan, and the how loaded some of these terms are, and helping perhaps some students who might have some religious affiliations that might perhaps create these binaries, or us versus them, or these hierarchies of what is primitive, what is more evolved, and so on, to also continue to have the tools to engage in these conversations. I think that's very important if we are to open their worlds up into more pluriversal understanding and more appreciation of these various knowledges and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ehaab, for bringing this session to a close. I'm always conscious how grateful I am, and perhaps we all are, of Zoom, so that we can join in these sessions from all different places around the world. But it would also be nice if we were in the same place, that we could follow up afterwards with some food or beverages. But I hope perhaps our paths will all cross down the line, and we can continue to talk about these things and teach and learn together some more. Thank you very much for today. I'll just drop it in the chat there. The recording will be available in Zoom later today, along with previous book launches. Thank you to all of our speakers and to our editors, and thank you to our guests for joining us today from wherever you are from. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next time.